Thanks, Mark. It's good to be back. Yeah, so I wanted to talk today about renewables profit at the base of the pyramid. And to do that, before jumping into a bunch of analysis and data and facts and things of that sort, I wanted to show photos of off-grid areas and hopefully some moving photos to better understand the context for this opportunity. So this, of all the photos I've taken, I try to find one that kind of captures the essence of what this opportunity is about. And this child, this is in Uganda, overlooking the Bawindi forest, which means darkness in the local language. He lives in abject poverty, has no access to energy or light. And I love the photo because, at least to me, he has kind of a pride almost, or a majesty to his face. Like he's going to go on and do amazing things. And he probably will. Selling solar devices in this context is the opportunity. It's the development opportunity in my mind. Quite simply, providing light allows children to read, which further increases demand for light. Leads to more reading, leads to more income, leads to more development. It's a virtuous circle. From a capitalistic point of view, this opportunity, as this photo shows, is about selling technology to new markets. There's about 3 billion people in the planet who earn between $2 and $10 a day, or rather live off of $2 to $10 a day. That's the largest consumer market segment in the world. It's kind of just above the base of the pyramid. So the title of the talk is actually slightly misleading because the opportunity is slightly above the base of the pyramid. These individuals have almost no technology. Perhaps the only technology they have are mobile phones. And I'll show some data to that effect. But this is fundamentally a capitalistic opportunity. It's selling technology in poor places. It's also about adventure. Some of the world's off-grid areas are beautiful. They're mountainous. They're full of adventure. I took this photo this winter while participating as an instructor in the Kumbu ice climbing school. And this, I think, at least for me personally, is what's drawn me into this space. Seeking out adventure in certain parts of the world has really opened my eyes to the opportunity for selling solar kits in off-grid places. Again, school children being able to read. I mean, this is what the opportunity is fundamentally about. It's a market for light. I'll show some data that illustrates how much people are paying for light, primarily through kerosene. It's a lot. It can be the majority, or, well, 20 to 30% of household income. But the majority of a daily expenditure. It's about conflict zones. This opportunity tends to overlap in conflict zones. Understanding geopolitical nuances, sectarian strife is relevant. There's tremendous conflict, particularly in Africa, where the economics are strongest. It's about displacing or leapfrogging primitive tools. One important point, at least that's been impressed upon me, is some primitive seeming tools are actually both not as primitive as you think and deeply entwined with the culture. So, for instance, in my time in Nepal, I've come to learn that mud technology or home building is really sophisticated. They're building mud homes on fault zones where earthquakes happen all the time in the Himalayas, and they last for many generations. The technology's been developed for millennia, and it's deeply entwined in the culture. So just as one example, not all technology that seems primitive is going to be displaced, but kerosene should be. It's about culture. This opportunity is about understanding unique cultures. This is kind of the National Geographic angle. The locations of most interest for off-grid lighting are kind of the same places that National Geographic photographers want to go take photos. They're the remote places of the world that people are inspired by, I think. It's about anthropology, understanding people in different cultural contexts. This is a shadu by the river Ganges. It's about ceremonies. It's about traditions, reconnecting with age-old modes of living, in this case, transport. And lastly, it's about kind of journeying on this planet, or connecting with the mystic is what I would say, but understanding different modes of thought. So hopefully that kind of captivated people's attention, and now you're ready to get pummeled with facts and figures. This chart is my attempt to sum up development indices, or really the usage of fundamental services on this planet. So at the top, you have population, roughly 7 billion people, global mobile connections, access to safe drinking water, electricity, access to improved sanitation, internet users, bank accounts, credit cards, TVs, PCs, personal vehicles or passenger vehicles. The bottom, Facebook users, Twitter users, and LinkedIn users. These are kind of the fundamental services that humans use, and how much they use them, or how many people actually have access to them. And what I find profound about this is, within a fairly short period of time, mobile has flipped the development pyramid. For instance, not that long ago, in 1998, mobile represented 1% of the population in developing countries. In other words, 1% of the population had access to mobile phones. 15 years later, about 5.1 of the 6.8 billion global mobile connections are in the developing world. And looking forward, 4 out of every 5 mobile connections are projected to be in the developing world. So that's unbelievably fast. It's now the pillar of development, and understanding the mobile telecom industry, its dynamics, its players, its trends, is very relevant to understanding further rungs of economic development. And another interesting thought, I guess, the Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn thing is interesting from the perspective of a quote I once heard, that fast-moving trends have all the attention, but slow-moving trends have all the power. And a lot of the categories on the top there, electricity, sanitation, I guess internet by now, maybe not, I don't know. But they're kind of slow-moving trends, but they certainly have a lot of power for people's lives. This phenomena of mobile usurping the development pyramid is particularly pronounced in sub-Saharan Africa. This chart shows a time series of mobile penetration as a percentage of total population versus improved water access, electrification rate, and improved sanitation access in sub-Saharan Africa. Most indices are really low. 30% electrification rate, maybe 31%, 28%. Improved sanitation, water, 56%. They're not terribly high for such a large piece of this planet. Africa, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa, is really, as I'll show later, the region, with the addition of India, that's is probably most relevant for this opportunity. This chart shows total number of people that are off the grid or don't have any energy access by region through time, it's actually projected out to 2030 by the IEA. And what it shows is tremendous gains in East Asia, primarily in China and Vietnam. Vietnam went from something like 1 or 2% electrification in the late 70s to 99% now. It's kind of a success story among the development community. Not a lot of progress in South Asia and an expanded unelectrified population in Africa, where population gains are slightly faster than electrification gains. This chart can also be interpreted as a market size. There's right now anywhere, estimates vary, between 1.2 and 1.4 billion people that don't have energy access. If you sell solar kits to even a few 100,000, that's a pretty profitable opportunity to look at. It depends which geography you're looking at and what the respective price of kerosene is and the economics inherent in that scenario. But in general, selling these systems, if it's the first technology that somebody's really bought aside from a mobile phone, could be as big as the way that we think about iPhones today. You know, everybody buys an iPhone in the developed world, or at least, you know, maybe just here in California, but you know, there's hundreds of millions of people that buy iPhones. This is an upward ceiling of billions. You can have some pretty big companies that play in this space once the economics work. Breaking down the geographies a little bit further in terms of where to focus. Again, sub-Saharan Africa is the most relevant. So this is analysis that projects business as usual infrastructure spend, primarily centralized grid infrastructure, the building of transmission lines in different geographies, where it's at 2005, where it would be at if trends stay the same in 2030, and where it would need to be to achieve universal energy access, which for this chart, because dollar signs aren't attached, is just an upward mark. But essentially what's shown is that in most regions, centralized grid infrastructure will expand to a significant portion of the population, except for sub-Saharan Africa. So if you're looking at this opportunity to potentially invest in a company or start a company or go to some geography to sell these systems, there's a significant risk that someday somebody comes in and builds an electricity grid and undermines your economics or provides more service everywhere, basically, except parts of sub-Saharan Africa. So this begs the question, is the development world thinking about this the wrong way? Is kind of doing what has been done in the developed world, building big grids, appropriate? And there's something called Maslow's hammer, which this guy, Maslow, he said, it's tempting if all you have is a hammer to treat everything as if it were a nail. And that kind of rings true in this instance. There's new creative thoughts and ways in which electricity can be provided. So two ideas fundamentally spring forth. One is providing electricity through microgrids built around telecom towers. And I'll go into that in detail. And the other is selling distributed solar kits. So this is the microgrid around telecom tower idea in a simple schematic. What it shows for the telecom industry writ large is the past, which is telecom operators building masts on top of towers, independent of each other, multiple masts at the same site, Verizon and AT&T and T-Mobile all building a mast right next to each other, and then selling spectrum, basically. Today, what's happened in most of the world is a trend towards infrastructure sharing of the actual mass. Sometimes the industry breaks it down by passive and active infrastructure. Passive would be like steel and the tower itself, and active would be like the control electronics associated with providing 3G versus 4G versus 2G versus 4G LTE, all these advances in telecom coverage so that we can get more and more data on our phones. So that's happened. New companies have filled in. They're publicly traded. They're very successful. They're very profitable to buy the infrastructure assets from telecom operators off of their books and then lease back the service of using those towers to multiple telecom companies. And they make a lot of money because they get multiple tenants. It's something called a tenancy multiplier on each tower, which dramatically increases their margin. And so some are thinking, well, if these specialist infrastructure providers are out there, doesn't it make sense that instead of just providing reliable mobile coverage, they also one day provide electricity, especially in places where telecom towers are really the only form of infrastructure? And what that would look like is microgrids built around the telecom towers, electrons being provided by hybrid renewable energy systems that are both powering the tower itself and local communities. It's a neat idea. I'll go through some pros and cons. I'm frankly, after spending a lot of time thinking about it, diving in, doing analysis, which I can show actually after I go through the presentation, some of the actual modeling, am bearish on this opportunity. I don't actually think it's practical. But it's kind of the first thought of how to do things differently than building centralized grids. So the logic in favor of doing this idea is one, telecom infrastructure is the only infrastructure in these places. Why not use it? Two, the operating entities can increase their revenue by selling electricity to villagers and potentially decrease their operational expenditure by reducing their reliance on diesel fuel, which is very expensive, and using solar and batteries and diesel generators. And the reason the hybrid opportunity makes sense is really kind of an engineering constraint. They fundamentally have to have the towers work. Cellular coverage has to be up and running. Otherwise, they don't make any money, or worse, they lose a big client. So having a diesel generator, even as a backup, is kind of a necessity. I'll show modeling again at the end that shows exactly how much is saved and how much more it costs up front to do this kind of thing. Telecom companies have credit ratings. They're on publicly traded stock exchanges. Therefore, if one engages in a contract, a long-term contract with one of these entities, they can receive financing. That's critical. Probably the hardest thing to developing energy solutions in this context is no one has a credit rating. There is no financing. At best, you're dealing with a state electricity service, which oftentimes is a mess. It's vastly preferable from a financing perspective to deal with an international company. Telecom companies have figured out already small ticket billing. They do it all over the world. Prepayments and mobile phone top-ups. It's fairly sophisticated, the back-end CRM system software that's necessary to know who's paid what, when, where, what their effective credit history is. This can directly be applied to electricity and energy. And then theft. Theft is kind of the big concern. If you put fancy solar panels in these places, won't they be stolen? The pro logic is, well, communities will highly value their new electricity and they won't steal the fancy equipment. In my travels, I don't necessarily think that's the case. Communities regularly steal from telecom tower infrastructure. There's kind of a psychology around stealing. There's a microeconomy built around telecom towers from servicing the various parts. There's also nearly instant replacement of anything that was stolen. and companies factor that in to their overall operation of these assets. So somebody comes in the night, perhaps somebody who even is hired to guard the infrastructure, steals lead-acid battery. I've seen them glued to the bottom of these things. They cut out the glue. And then it's replaced the next day. So there's, unfortunately, a psychology around stealing from these towers. It's kind of anonymized. It's not assigned to anyone within a community, so there's no social pressures. It's probably my biggest concern with this idea. Renewable energy equipment is very expensive respective to a diesel generator. So other primary impediments. Telecom companies are not in the business of providing electricity. Clearly, they're in the business of providing reliable mobile coverage. The concern is that by complicating the engineering, by both mixing AC and DC supply, generator, solar panel, and expanding the net of demand from a reliable source of demand, a telecom tower, to a community, unreliable, that it could jeopardize network uptime and therefore jeopardize the whole premise of what the company does. So from an engineering perspective, if you speak to the people who are charged with making decisions about diesel procurement or buying renewable energy hybrid systems, they are concerned. There's a cost of capital gap. These projects are in the 5 to 15% range for an internal rate of return, and that would be great in the US or the developed economy context, but in developing countries, prime sector lending rates can be 20+%. So it's not quite profitable enough. As soon as you build electricity lines, especially in developing countries, you're subject to myriad regulatory hurdles and vested interests from electricity companies that don't want somebody coming into their turf and selling electricity. So from an independent power provider perspective, it can take years. It can take lots of flights, lots of trips. It can dramatically increase overhead, long permitting processes. Grid extension, which I mentioned earlier, can undercut project economics. Telecom towers are typically located on top of hills, a far distance away from communities. From some of the geographic analysis I've done in, for instance, Tanzania and Kenya, about 80% of the towers were on hills too far away from a community to make it actually work. And then theft, which I just talked about. So all of those reasons combined, and that's why I'm bearish about option number one for a new way to provide electricity to the base of the pyramid or just above the base of the pyramid. So option number two is solar home systems. It's a distributed solution. It doesn't require electricity wires. It requires kit, or in other words, electronics, lithium-ion battery, solar PV, LED lights, casing, a box, and an ability to repay through someone's mobile phone. And that's the critical link. This is a photo of one such kit. This is Off-Grid Electric, I think, in Tanzania. To show the opportunity, I wanted to show one company's success, really. Each dot is a customer, time-lapsed. Each slide will be 2 months, month and a half, 2 months. So that was about an 8-month time period, and around the mountain of Arusha, I don't know, thousands of customers signed up. Thousands of units were installed very quickly. It almost looks like a virus kind of spreading. It's incredible, the raw demand that's bubbling up for these systems in certain parts of the world. And the reasons are vast, which I'll go into in more detail, but at its most fundamental, people are saving money by buying these systems. kerosene prices are high, and phone charging costs are high. And there's really no electrical infrastructure in these locations. The phone charging bit, let's see. Well, I'll get to it in a sec, but the phone charging bit can be quite usurious. Shopkeepers can charge multiple dollars to charge a phone, which it should only cost 10 cents at most. They do it because they can. This figure is too much for the eyes, but it just shows a number of companies that are doing this in different geographies. They all have different business models and different scale and costs and geographies and all these things. And I just wanted to show that this is kind of a movement sprouting up, and there's lots of for-profit enterprises seeking this opportunity out. And lots of potential investment in these companies. This slide shows the fundamental economics, and I want to spend a little bit of time on this one. The left yellowish part is the levelized cost of various options for energy or for light, and the right is both the down payment or the upfront cost and the recurring cost. The left is most relevant and easiest to look at. So what you have is average amount of money somebody in this category, this $2 to $10 a day category, would spend on phone charging, candles, advanced lanterns, kerosene, et cetera, if this was their option for either light or energy. And what this shows, and from all of my research and everyone I've spoken with, this rings true. These solar kits on a levelized basis are cheaper than kerosene plus phone charging. So if somebody's paying on a regular basis for kerosene and they're paying to charge their phone, they save money, 15% or so, by buying a solar kit, either upfront or, if the option is available, which some companies are just now figuring out, financed with payments through a mobile money program. And then some of the other options, like MicroGrid, solar home systems. Let's see, does this work? The real problem, the upfront cost, this is for a microgrid to the consumer. If somebody wants to connect to a microgrid, solar home systems, upfront cost to the consumer, grid extension, upfront cost to the consumer, they don't have that kind of money up front. It's kind of a non-starter. And then low quality lanterns, which unfortunately have flooded the market from China mostly, are unknowingly one of the most expensive options because they cost very little up front, but the replacement of batteries on a regular basis is so much that on a levelized chart, it's one of the least economic options. And the same with flashlights. So this is more along the economic rationale side. These are the component pieces of the kit of what we're talking about potentially selling. There's the electronics, the housing, assembly, solar panel, the LED, the battery. These pieces are manufactured from all over the world. Companies have to sit down and strategize, what do I source from where? Do I get my solar panel from Germany? Do I get my electronics from Vietnam? Do I get my software from Russia? How do I then optimize shipping? Where is it assembled? How do I minimize tariffs? All these are complex strategy questions. But what this chart shows is the decline in all of these costs. Almost everything listed is benefiting from a tailwind of aggressive learning curves. So solar panels famously drop in cost 24% for every doubling of production capacity. LEDs somewhere around there. Lithium-ion batteries around 14% from data that I've seen. They're all dropping in costs pretty dramatically. So the overall cost of the kit should drop anywhere between 30 and 50% by 2015, respective to 2010, while kerosene price, which is what it's competing with, should increase about 30 to 40%. And I'll show some data that indicates that. So this is kerosene prices in key markets for off-grid solar, they're all going up. On average, 7.6% compound annual growth rate. Kerosene prices are intrinsically linked to oil prices. Geopolitical stability can really mess up both diesel and kerosene prices. I was told in Uganda that when violence broke out in Kenya 4 or 5 years ago, the price per liter of gasoline and therefore kerosene went from $1.30 up to $8 for 4 months. That shuts down an entire economy. Nobody can run their business. Everything breaks. People are sensitive to this reality, especially in landlocked regions with geopolitical strife. So it's a further emphasis for switching off of kerosene. The cost trends that I just showed, the downward 30 to 50% cost trend over 5 years, is actually just the first part of the cumulative cost to an end consumer. It's the component costs. There's assembly, there's margin baked in for whoever manufactures these devices or the company that sells them. There's shipping, there's taxes and duties, and then there's last mile distribution and retail costs to actually get these things out to consumers. So while the component costs are all kind of coming down quite aggressively, that's only 30% or so of the overall cost to a consumer. So the overall cost should not come down as aggressively. What will make the overall cost come down significantly is if the taxes and duty structure is changed. So import VAT tax, import tax, the VAT tax when a company sells the device to a distributor, and then the customer VAT tax, and then a shipping port tax, all combined, and they can be more than the actual price of the device. So that's a big policy problem that effectively doubles unnecessarily, some would say, the price of something that a lot of high-level policy types want to flourish anyway. So some companies are beginning to change to that effect, some countries. This lists countries with no solar duties. On the left side and on the right side, no solar customer VAT tax. And you can see it's mostly East African countries that have really taken the lead in this. India, which is one of the biggest markets, also has a reduced VAT tax. What's happening, though, in this game is people who sell things in these geographies they're trying to game the system. They're putting solar panels onto things that don't need a solar panel so that they don't have a tax structure. There's significant political back and forth over how you actually accomplish what should and should not be taxed, because it adds up to a significant amount of money depending on what you're selling. There's also nuances over certain countries want to incentivize local manufacturing and therefore will tax the manufactured device but not the components. There's a lot of nuance in this policy space. Mobile money. Mobile money is kind of the second or third pillar, really, of why this opportunity is exciting now. So the first pillar of why this opportunity is exciting now is the cost trends and the economics. The second part is mobile money programs are flourishing. So this chart shows total amount or total number of transactions on the y-axis and total amount of transactions on the x-axis in different geographies. And the growth rate in amount or number of transactions for major markets is huge. It's 40% per year. There's now more money being transacted through mobile money programs than PayPal. It's really big now. And people in developing countries, particularly banks, are kind of they're really concerned. Our telecoms, all of a sudden banks, regulators are saying you can't use the money that people are giving you as a market participant In other words, you can't invest or trade with it like an insurance fund might, like your 401k might. There's a lot of complications over what happens when all of a sudden everybody puts their money into mobile money accounts versus a bank, because a telecom is not structured to be a bank. Regardless, this is what people are doing in the parts of the world that are relevant for this opportunity. And it allows the critical missing link for financing. It allows, if somebody pays small sum payments for energy through their mobile phone, that can be tracked. And tracking those payments allows developing data and credit history that one can go to a credit committee and receive financing for. And whether that's a multilateral development institution or a private equity firm or some institutional or individual investor, that data is fundamentally the missing link to asset financing of these devices. Because what these companies are ultimately trying to do is spend money for somebody to manufacture all the pieces and then have all the pieces shipped somewhere and then have somebody buy it and then slowly repay over a period of time. They need money up front to do that. They need financing. And to get that financing, they need this data that mobile money programs unlock. This is another chart that shows the growth of mobile money programs is just number of programs by geography. It's just another way of showing that, that it's dramatic. The growth of these programs is quite dramatic. This is a business model slide. This is a business model point. Some companies in this space are selling on a lease-to-own model. So somebody comes in one day and buys the device for an upfront cost, and then over periodic payments slowly pays it off until they own it. Other companies are doing a perpetual lease, which is like your utility bill or like your electricity bill here in the US. It's a smaller periodic payment and it goes on forever. And the company is therefore owning your relationship or your usage of energy. What this slide shows is the cash flow streams associated with either choice. And the business model fundamentally changes. The technology choice fundamentally changes as well, depending on which avenue a company goes down. But essentially, my opinion is the exciting opportunity is in a perpetual lease model. Because if somebody owns the customer relationship, that customer is comfortable with that brand and knows where to go to get that solar device and is regularly paying for that solar device, then that company has the ability to sell further services over time to that customer. Maybe one day it's an electric razor, maybe the next day it's a radio, maybe the next day it's a small refrigerator, maybe the next day it's a small air conditioner. It starts to look a lot like more than just selling electricity. It starts to look a lot like selling services. Whatever those services may be, depends. That's the biggest opportunity, but it's also probably the longest opportunity. It'll take the longest to actually realize that. Right now, as we sit here today, what companies have historically done is just sold devices on an upfront basis, ideally manufactured for as cheap as they can be, and just sold them right up front. There's been no financing, there's been no pay-as-you-go element. The interim step is this lease-to-own. The long-term step is probably this perpetual lease model. The health and environmental impacts are long. There's a long list of benefits or social impact benefits associated with this opportunity, but here are some of the most prescient. 2 million people die every year from the indirect effects of burning kerosene indoors. That's according to the World Health Organization. 2/3 of adult females with lung cancer in developing countries are non-smokers. That's pretty revealing. That's because they're burning kerosene indoors. That's according to the World Bank. Black carbon, soot, Mark Jacobson's research can attest to this, is considered to be number 2 global warming impact or forcing agent. The new IPCC report details that. Black carbon soot is a byproduct, clearly, of burning kerosene. But critically, it's a byproduct of burning kerosene in places near glaciers. I'm thinking particularly of the Himalayas. And as those soot emissions waft up from the monsoon season, the high pressure pushes them into the Himalayas. They fall. They absorb more sunlight. They melt glaciers faster. It has significant impact for the Himalayan glaciers, which are, by the numbers, the single largest source of water for people on this planet. There's a side note here, really, which just quantifies the BC emissions. Black carbon emissions are slightly less than solid cooking fuels or diesel fuels, but they're still significant. And then the educational and income generation impact are there, as I've said a few times, that just more lighting leads to more reading, which generates more income and more lighting demand in a virtuous development circle. It's a simple but arguably the most powerful note, really, about what could happen. This chart is a lot of information. It shows, I've gone through every country in the world and ranked them according to where the opportunity is for solar home pay-as-you-go systems. A weighted average of various development and price indices. So rural population without electricity, mobile connections per 100 people, electrification percentage of total population, average kerosene prices, and the IFC ease of doing business ranking. What stands out, the red ones that I've highlighted, is just that Africa and African countries are preferable. They're, for all of these reasons, when you do the math and you weight it out, they're better places to pursue this opportunity. But there are clearly many others. India is 405 million people without, rural people without access to electricity. Almost an order of magnitude larger than any other single country. Yet kerosene price, 36 cents a liter, is less than half of all the other countries that are relevant. So that's why India doesn't really rank as high. That's why it's not as interesting of a proposition. Even though it has this gigantic market size, kerosene prices are subsidized. It's just not as good from an economic perspective pursuing this opportunity there. Also, grid expansion in India is underfoot. There's significant investment in new grid infrastructure in India that will kind of erase the opportunity in many regions. But looking closer at India, this map shows kerosene usage, percentage of the population that uses kerosene in zones throughout India. This data is from the UN and GIS mapped. And it becomes clear that the kerosene usage is, as I said previously, really tucked closely to the Himalayas, all the red on the map. And the market size is so large, and that average kerosene price is just that. It's an average. It's in urban districts. If you go outside of an urban district, kerosene price can be 2 to 3 times what the pump price is, or what the World Bank says it is in an urban center. There's tremendous opportunity to just go, put a flag down and start trying to sell these systems really anywhere in India, or many places that don't have electricity access. This photo is just a reminder of why there aren't grids there. It's mountainous, right? This is another GIS modeling attempt to look at the economics of diesel versus solar. And it's looking at transmission lines and road access and insulation values and population densities. And what you see clearly is a lot of red, but also some blue, which is where diesel is more economic. And where it's more blue is almost entirely because of policies and diesel subsidies and petro dictatorships, usually. This was the cover of The Economist not that long ago. What is it, June 1st? About 2 billion people lived below the poverty line a decade ago. Now it's about 1 billion. People are saying it'll perhaps even be 0 in the next decade. Maybe that's optimistic, but shaving the number in half in 10 years is pretty amazing. This opportunity is clearly part of this long trend. It has the tailwind of the world's attempts to eradicate extreme poverty. And everybody that escapes extreme poverty is a potential customer. So again, 3 billion people live on between $2 and $10 a day, largest consumer market in the world. That number is only going to grow. This opportunity's market size is also only going to grow. So that's the end of my presentation. I have more slides related to the modeling of the hybrid renewable energy genset tower power idea, but I'm probably pretty close to running out of time, so I'm happy to leave those for the class afterwards. Thank you all for your time.
We have time for some questions, and I think students go first. Yeah.
Yeah, so I actually work for a company in this industry, and from what we've seen, the biggest barrier to growth seems to be working capital, especially for distributors and people down the chain. Do you see there being an influx of working capital into this industry in the near future, and if so, from which types of players?
Yeah. Which company? V-Box? Yeah. Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, that's the question. Unlocking asset finance for working capital is the missing ingredient to this space. It seems most are looking at it from coming from multilateral development institutions, and there's a lot of strategies around what's made where as it pertains to either OPIC financing or USAID. It's possible that that this space opens up with a private bank, like Barclays, for instance, introduced a few $1 million securitized line to a company called Azuri Technologies. But it seems experimental at this stage. Nobody's really proved out where that money comes from. And everyone's kind of projecting that there's millions per month of debt financing some years from now. And it's entirely theoretical at this point. So figuring that out is a really interesting space to spend your time.
Yeah, in the center.
So learning from the history of the telecom industry, what did they do to make the transition from being a multilateral development bank financed operation to a private sector interested in much broader scale operation?
Yeah, it's a good question. The parallels are strong, and I didn't mention it before, but if you look at some of the numbers like gross margin for solar home systems versus telecom, or EBITDA per customer, or average revenue per customer, or average spend per customer, all these metrics, they look like the same thing between a telecom company and a solar home system provider. And telecom companies in these parts of the world are the biggest, most influential private sector players around. So yeah, the question becomes, what did they do? Overseas development assistance was a big part of it. I didn't say this as well earlier, but overseas development assistance tallies to like $134 billion per annum. And for reference, the centralized grid expansion world is about 10 billion of that per annum. Clearly, if those that are spending that amount of money shift their focus a little bit towards solar home systems as opposed to centralized grid infrastructure, that really changes the dynamic. Perhaps that's where the money comes from, but that hasn't happened yet. The other thing that telecom companies did is they unlocked asset financing, and that's kind of a investment bankers or corporate finance world. And solar home system companies are still kind of in this social impact investment paradigm, and they're they're not at that scale of seriousness, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. So you were talking a little bit about the kits before, the kits that they used to sell the solar panels. What else can we include there? I mean, I know some people are putting DC appliances that might, have the potential to make the system less complicated. But do you see, it being like there maybe a missing link, maybe a DC computer that runs somewhere that's much cheaper that we can bundle with these things and just sell it, as a bigger kit that's going to further the development even more.
Yeah, I think there's definitely room for that. I think the business model of a perpetual lease for pay-as-you-go solar enables that. It allows somebody to sell DC appliances, which are significantly cheaper, which to date have mostly been manufactured for like the boating industry. There could be specialized manufacturers for the developing economy context, coupled with solar pay-as-you-go. But I think it starts with the solar. It starts with light. It starts with a few LEDs and a mobile phone charger, and then it progresses to, pretty small energy-consuming devices at first, like a radio or a razor are pretty commonly cited usage, and then maybe one day a laptop, maybe a simple laptop, but probably a tablet before a laptop, and that there's room for that within the right business model, but it's not happening yet. It's too soon, I think, for that.
Yes. Go ahead.
So definitely, I think the benefits of implementing these types of renewable technologies are clear. But going back to the beginning of your presentation, when you were talking about how culturally rich these societies are and how based in tradition they are, what is kind of the moral thought process behind introducing these kind of industrial technologies to an unindustrialized society? You kind of doing kind of like a support industrialization process for them, and what's kind of the moral thought process behind that?
Yeah, in all of my expeditions with National Geographic, I think about this question because there's clearly I kind of always see this from a Westerner's eye. There's the thought process: these places are sacred. They're the only places like it that exist in the world. They shouldn't be changed. They should stay this way so the world can experience them. They shouldn't industrialize, they shouldn't develop. And then when I interact with people, they want roads, they want electricity, they want better school. They want all these things. And usually they end up just leaving their cultures is what happens, and forgetting their language, things like that. So there's definitely a moral question there. I don't frankly think that introducing light is as big a deal on that moral spectrum as developing a power plant or something. But yeah, that's always going to be there.
Yeah, go ahead.
For the solar kits or the solar home systems, are there any important differences in the devices that would be deployed in very, very different regions? And if not, then what are the important differences about how people would go about it?
From a technology perspective?
Sure.
There's lots of technology choices, and they seem to kind of net out from a cost perspective, but not from a quality perspective. So a lot of entities, a lot of companies are selling around the same cost.
Sorry, I guess my question was, if you're selling such in Africa or in India, do you need to make a different device, or could you just sell the same thing everywhere?
Yeah, you could. It depends upon your business model. So the crux of the business model is distribution and how fast you do it. Do you focus on one geography, and therefore own the customer relationship in that geography, or do you not own the customer relationship and sell to distributors in specific geographies and therefore scale faster, but have less potential for higher earnings per customer in the future? And that's a business model choice, and it directly relates to the technology that you choose as well. So they're all kind of intertwined. It's possible to sell the same device in different geographies, for sure. But when companies are trying to figure this out, they have to decide that among a variety of other strategic decisions, and they end up with, with who they are, what they try and do.
Okay. One more question.
Thanks. Back to kind of cultural integration. How do you expect this somewhat uneducated population to use and interact and control these systems, as well as even repair them? Because these lead acid batteries might only have cycle lives for 3 to 5 years in these humid climates. How do you expect them to replace them, fix them, and know how to use them?
It's the first generation of solar lanterns and small solar kits that's a big critique from the environmental communities. They don't last that long, and they end up doing more harm than good because they end up just being electronic waste in these parts of the world. This is another reason why I prefer the perpetual lease model. If somebody is responsible for the customer relationship and for somebody paying over time for that service, then whoever is responsible will replace, repair, maintenance, warranty, all of these things for the actual device, and therefore that problem goes away. The batteries will, over time last longer. Some last longer than others, but 3 to 5 years is enough time from a profit perspective, from getting your enough money back to finance more sales. I'm not sure. Does that answer your original question? Yeah.
Okay, well, if you have additional questions, I'm sure Ted will answer them individually if you come up, but we should stop now.